Hey there, I wanted to take a brief moment and welcome you to the Focus Point podcast. If this is one of the first episodes that you're hearing from us, please head over to our website, thepointoffocus.com, where you can find out some more information about who we are, what we're doing. You can also find other podcast episodes and blog posts there as well. That's thepointoffocus.com. I'm so glad that you decided to give one of our episodes a listen. I really hope that you will be blessed and encouraged through what you hear in this episode. I also encourage you to share this episode with your family and your friends. Once again, I just thank you for taking some time and listening to our episode. Now, let's dive in to today's episode. Well, we are in our second episode of our At the Movies series, a summer annual thing that we do. This year we're calling it Inside Out, as we are looking more at one movie, where in the past we've looked at multiple different movies. And so we try to do a series like this once a year, just because it's good to see that God will use other things to talk to us. As long as we're listening, we can hear God talk to us. And I've always liked doing these kind of series. So if you have a copy of the Bible, go ahead, open it on up to 1 Samuel chapter 17. That's where we're going to be today. We're going to look at the story that God has provided us in that text. We're also going to be, this series is loosely kind of going to be using some Proverbs as we kind of look at that book a little bit. Not a deep dive study, but we are going to be kind of using a proverb as kind of like a platform to kind of, maybe not in every episode, but throughout the series, we're going to be kind of looking at some proverbs as well. So I'm excited for this. Last week, we kicked it off with a look at anger. And we talked about how anger shows up in lots of different ways, but we used some text in the book of Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 through 32, and we just kind of spent some time in that text and seeing what Jesus says about our anger, and seeing what Paul, getting from Jesus, right? What Paul has said about it. And it comes out of our theme verse that's found in the book of Philippians. If you've been listening to this podcast for a little bit, we did a series called I've Got the Joy. We started the year off, and we've been just trekking through, and we just trekked through the book of Philippians, and we just finished it up back in June. And so, but our theme verses for the series come out of Philippians. Philippians chapter 4, verses 12 and 13, and it says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. So we kind of hooked onto that. And so talked about anger last week. This week we're diving into a little bit about fear. And fear manifests in lots of different ways. There, I can speak, I promise. So a few things though that I've been thinking as the series was taking shape. And so take a listen to these words. And I said, fear is a killer. Fear robs us of our happiness. Fear robs us of joy. Fear robs us in our relationships. Fear robs us in our progress. Fear robs us of things we do not know we are being robbed of. And that's the scary one right there. Being robbed of things we don't even know that we're missing out on. Fear has robbed us in the past. Fear robs us in the present, and it'll rob us in the future. Fear is a killer. Fear kills dreams. Fear kills goals. Fear kills relationships. Fear kills what God has for us. Fear is a killer. When we think about just that brief, that idea, fear is those things. Fear keeps us from doing things that we should do. Fear keeps us from doing things that we could do. We just don't know that we can because we don't want to try, or we don't want to fail, or we don't want to, all of these things. But God, these words, but God, have echoed in my head for a long time. It even comes up in my wife's walk with God. Like, she's saying some things and she's processing through some things, and then she goes, "But God," and it's like those words are almost starting to carry like negative weight in a joking way, but it's almost kind of like, "But God," because sometimes we need to know what God says. So these "but God" moments. And God has something different to say about fear. And he says, fear isn't a killer. Fear is dead. Fear isn't a killer. Fear is dead. 2 Timothy 1:7 tells us God has not given us a spirit of fear, but God has not given us a spirit of fear or timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. God has not given us a spirit of fear. So fear isn't of God. We all face situations where we feel timid and afraid. For some, speaking in front of a lot, for wondering what's going to happen to the kids, or wondering if they're going to make the right choices. Fear, sometimes comes from confrontation, or being made to look foolish, or failing, or rejection. We all deal with fear. But the first thing we should remember is that fear is not from God. Fear is from the devil. Because that verse tells us that God has not given us the spirit of fear. But the first one, God has given us power over fear. God has given us power. And our verse from Proverbs tells us that. A lot of fear comes from the fact that we don't know what's going on, right? We don't know what's next. We don't know if we can do this. We don't know if we can take that step. We don't know all of these different things. Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not depend on your own understanding. That's verse 5. Because when we depend on our own understanding, we tend to mess things up. We tend to try and do things our own way. And sometimes we don't do anything because we're depending on our own understanding. Oh, and I'm scared, and we can't do it. Seek. So we don't, right? So verse 6 says, seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. This tells us fear comes from depending on ourselves and not fully trusting God, who gives us the power over fear. So real quick, let's read 3 things about fear. Fear isn't a killer. Fear is dead. Fear is dead because God has given us the power over fear. But fear comes from depending on ourselves and not fully trusting God, who gives us the power over fear. So, in this story that we are going to be looking at, maybe you've already been there. Once again, 1 Samuel chapter 17 is where we're going to be. It's a familiar story, David and Goliath. And this story isn't as much about what happens, right? Spoiler, David kills Goliath. That's not what this is about. This is about everything that we've already talked about that builds in this story because of fear. In the story, we are going to see how fear is a killer if we let it, like King Saul does. But we also are going to see how fear is dead if we just trust God, which is what David did. So let's kick off the story here. 1 Samuel chapter 17, and it says, the Philistines now mustered their army for battle and camped between those places. Sometimes Old Testament names are fun to try and say. I'm not going to really say it. You're reading along with me. There you are. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and the Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with a valley between them. Then Goliath, the champion of Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet and a bronze coat of mail that weighed 125 pounds. He wore bronze leg armor and carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was heavy and thick. Was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor-bearer walked ahead of him, carrying a shield. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt from across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I am a Philistine champion, but you only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves, but if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send a man who will fight me." Here it is, verse 11. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Now, this is a very, very interesting time. King Saul, the king of Israel, leader of the people, right, is shaking in his boots because of Goliath. I mean, he has every right to be, right? Just staring him in the face, right? Goliath, 9 feet tall. He's got armor that he's wearing that weighs more than most human beings. And Saul and the Israelites are terrified and deeply shaken. I think here they've forgotten who's on their side, who's fighting for them back in Israel's history, right? Moses stood at them at the banks of the Red Sea and goes, "God is fighting for us." We see it throughout the book of Joshua as they start to trek through the promised land, the Jericho and the people of all these other, the Lord is fighting for them. Like, it is clear, that the Lord is fighting for them. Skipping on down to verse, let's see, where's my notes? Sorry, verse 32, verse 32 and 33. It says, David is the son of Jesse, and Jesse is going to send David to see his brothers who are in the army of King Saul, and he's trying to figure out what's going on, and he's trying to figure out all of these different things. They're scared. He's trying to figure out who's going to kill this Philistine, and he says that I'll kill him. I'll do it. And this is what he tells King Saul. "Don't worry about this Philistine." Sorry, we're in verse 32. He says, "Don't worry about this Philistine," David told Saul. "I'll go fight him." "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There is no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You are a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth." There's a lot I could talk about in that verse, but we're going to, not now. So, as this goes on, in verses 34 through 40, David tells Saul that he's killed lions and bears to protect his father's sheep. David tells Saul that the same God that rescued him from the lion and the bear will rescue him from Goliath. So we see right here where David's trust is and where Saul's trust is not. Saul's trust, like we've said, is depending on his own understanding. I understand, this is Saul thinking, right? Maybe you've been there when you're facing whatever you're facing. This is Saul looking at Goliath and going, this is my own understanding of the situation. We're going to get squashed like bugs because Goliath is 9 feet tall, and there's other giants in there, as the story is going to indicate later, that there's other giants back there. So if we even get close to even injuring this one, there's other ones, right, that are going to hurt. Not to mention the Philistine army is going to come after us. And Saul is just gripped by that. That is what's happening. This is what's going to happen. In the movie Inside Out, in the first Inside Out, fear is tasked with figuring out what could happen on Riley's first day at a new high school when they moved to San Francisco, right? And he's got a whole list of things of what could happen, and the first thing that happens is the number one thing on his list, right? So looking at these situations like that, right? Saul is looking, this is bad, and there's no way out of it, so we're just not going to do anything, right? David, on the other hand, is, I've seen what God can do. You've seen what God can do, but obviously you're not going to see it, Saul. But God has rescued me before from things that I shouldn't be able to kill with my own two hands. So Saul finally lets David do it. And in verse 37, we say, "May the Lord be with you." Which is interesting that Saul said that, because he's showing contrast here. He's scared to death to fight Goliath, but he knows the Lord is there somewhere. Maybe it's because David told Saul about the things that God has rescued him from. I don't know. But Saul wanted David to go in his armor, but it was too heavy. So David just takes his slingshot and 5 smooth stones. Once again, that's an indication that there was other giants there that he may have to fight. And this is a very interesting side of this story. But we see what happens. Verse 41, let's pick up the story. Verse 41, Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this boy. "Am I a dog?" he roared at David, "that you come at me with a stick?" And he cursed David by the names of his gods. "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals," Goliath yelled. David replied to the Philistine, "You come at me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come at you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today I will conquer you, and I will kill you, and I will cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with a sword and a spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he has given it. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us." And Goliath moved closer to attack, and David ran quickly to meet him. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with a mighty sling, and it hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. See, David knew what God could do. And his fear wasn't, I'm sure David was scared to death. I can't imagine that he wasn't scared. But he knew who to trust. He didn't trust his own understanding, because I'm pretty sure he had the same understanding as Saul. Like, he was smaller than Saul, right? And if anything goes wrong, well, this isn't going to be good for anybody, because they'll just send out the other giants, they'll send out their entire army, we'll be wiped out. But David knew what to say to himself. He says, seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. David didn't let his fear get a hold of him. Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. This stuff about fear comes from things of our own understanding and the way we see things. And it's hard. I'm not sitting here saying, come on, you guys, get it together. I've got it all figured out. I've passed the fear test. got an A+. No. This is a test for me, too. This is a study for me, too. As I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about all of this, David fought Goliath because he trusted in what God had done for him, what God could do for him, what God will do for him. And that's just so much power, because God has given us the power over fear. And this is what happens when fear, this is what happens when we take the power that God has given us. This is what happens to fear. Then David ran over and pulled out Goliath's sword. David used it to cut off his head. When the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they turned and ran. Fear runs away. My goodness, I'm sitting here and this is all coming to me so fast, and I hope I'm making it clear to you as you're listening. Fear runs away. There's songs about fear. Fear doesn't stand a chance. That fear is not the boss of us. That God has given us power over fear. The Bible tells us 365 different times to not be afraid. So the takeaway that I have when we're faced with fear, when we're faced with something that we think we can't do, something that we know we can't do, something that we choose to not do because we're scared, whatever, it doesn't matter. Whatever the quote-unquote Goliath is in our life, fear falls under our own understanding of a situation. I'm never going to get a good grade on a test because I just don't take tests well. I'm never going to be as wealthy as that person. I'm never going to be able to get a promotion. I'm never going to be able to pursue one of the biggest dreams or goals that I have. I'm never going to get there. I'm never going to do all this because I can't. I can't do it. I can't make the team. I can't make good grades. I can't witness to somebody about Jesus. I can't. But that is not what the Bible tells us. That is our own understanding. But Jesus tells us that we have the power over that. So, seek His will in all you do, and He will show you which path to take. God gives us the strength to handle fear, to handle anger, and to handle anything else we're going to talk about in this series. That's why mainly Philippians 4:13 is a theme verse for this series. And as we trust in the Lord, and as we focus on Him, it says with all our heart, and do not depend on your own understanding. I am so excited that God has given us the power and the authority over fear. We don't have to be afraid. We don't have to fear anymore. Fear doesn't stand a chance. Fear isn't a killer. Fear is dead. So, as we look back at some of these things, last week we had a challenge. Where can we get rid of some of these things, right? Ephesians 4:31, getting rid of all of these different things and choosing to be kind and compassionate and all of that, and doing that through Christ who gives us strength. Where are some things that we're fearful about right now? Where are some things that's causing us some fear? Because fear leads to other things, as we're clear about. Fear leads to other things. One of them is anxiety, which we are going to talk about in this series. But fear just cripples us. If we let fear take a hold of us, and if we don't use the power that God has given us, fear can just take us down. Fear can rob us. Fear can steal things from us. Fear can just kill our dreams, kill our goals, kill our progress, kill our relationships. Fear can just take us out. That is the scary thing about fear. And when I thought about it, when God told me fear robs us of things we don't even know we are being robbed of, that was enough for me. Like that was enough for me. Because we see in this story, fear was robbing Israel. Fear was robbing King Saul, but in effect robbing Israel of a big defeat over the Philistines. Because fear was there. They were trusting in their own understanding. And that's what fear was robbing them of. And if they would have let fear, if David didn't come along, if David didn't decide to do what he was going to do, if all how the story played out, right? If David didn't do what he did, Israel wouldn't have defeated the Philistines. As a matter of fact, they could have been defeated by the Philistines. They wouldn't have known what God could do for them. And fear does that to us. I think that's what God wants us to hear. I think that's what God wanted me to hear. Is that fear takes away from things that we don't even know it's taken away from. There are things that we've missed out in our life because we were afraid. And that's so real to me. And that just kind of like shook me up a little bit. And so what do you do with it? Well, we start looking at things, right? We do an inventory. We do an analysis, or whatever words you want to use, just like I talked about last week. What are some things that cause us to get angry? What are some things that, like all of that, well, what are some things that we're fearful of? What if we just turn that over to the power of God and we just trust Him with it? We trust Him with all our heart. We seek His will in all we do so He can show us which path to take. How would that be a little bit different? You know, I've heard it said, failure only happens when we don't try. Like we fear that we're going to not succeed, right? We're not going to get that promotion. We're not going to make that team. We're not going to get that position that we want, or whatever, right? And all of that is true, but we don't know that. We don't know all of those feelings and emotions. We don't know that any of that's true. The feeling is true. The words are true as they're running through our head, but are they? We don't know what our boss is going to do. We don't know what grade we're going to get on the test. We don't know what position we're going to get on the football team. We don't know any of those things until we try. And if we don't ever try, well, we don't ever know. If we don't ever know, well, then what are we missing out on? And the same goes with God. Like, if God is encouraging us to do something, we're just like, no, I'm afraid, I can't. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if all of these different things? What if? And we miss out on what God has for us. So my encouragement today, as we close out this episode, is just do an analysis. What are some things that we're afraid of? Where can we apply Proverbs 3, 5, and 6? What else can we see in this story in 1 Samuel 17 that will encourage us to trust God more? Because that's where I'm at. I'm more interested not in the things that, like, I'm more worried about the things that I've missed out on in my past, because I just didn't want to take a step because I was afraid. What things have I missed out on recently? What are some things? And that is just, I'm talking in a circle and I know it, but I just feel like that's what God wants us to hear. What are we being robbed of because of fear? Why don't we just take the power that God has given us and just knock fear upside the head? And take the victories that God has given us. Take that power that God has given us. Because fear doesn't come from God. Fear is not of God. God didn't give us fear. So I hope that encourages you. I hope you'll take that with you this week. I hope that you'll come back as we continue on in our Inside Out series and our At the Movies series. I'm really excited to continue on, especially with the topic next week. It's something that I've heard several years ago. So as we dive into embarrassment and shame next week, it comes from a question that God asks, right? That's kind of understood in the text that we're going to read. But the founding pastor of my church said it in a way that stuck with me for well over probably a decade. So I'm excited to share that with you next week as we continue on in our Inside Out series. I hope to see you there.